A little intro about Anastasia. She's a certified mindfulness instructor and holds a master's in teaching. She's very passionate about practicing mindfulness, and it's rooted in positive outcomes that she has witnessed in herself and in her students. She deeply believes that the mindfulness training is a powerful technique and a tool that can transform lives by restoring health and wellness. Let's get started.
Good morning. I did not bring this weather. I want to make this very clear. Because the last time I tried to come out on February 11th, it didn't happen. Although my determination was in place, I got halfway and then Matt called and said, nah, it's better to call it. So today we have rain. It is what it is, right? Mindfulness is a big topic, and we have limited time today to dive into it. So it's really my intention to give you some background on the practice and to talk about my own experiences and hopefully to engage your curiosity so that you'll do some further investigation on your own. My intention today isn't to convince you of anything. As an educator, I'm fully aware and believe that curiosity, and especially skepticism, are attributes that can lead to new learning and new experiences. Looking back on my life, I've come to realize that I was gifted with an overactive nervous system, and I'm really feeling that right now, by the way. I used to be extremely anxious. I had mastered the art of worrying at an early age. It's also true that there were threatening and traumatic circumstances in my life as I was growing up that contributed to this inclination of anxiety and chronic worrying. It was sort of a mixed, toxic bag of things. And as I became aware of these patterns of suffering that I was experiencing, I tried many different treatment options, all of which never really seemed to give me lasting relief and never made me feel like my true self, balanced and at home in my own skin. It was quite by accident that I stumbled upon mindful awareness practice. I was reading a book by Jon Kabat-Zinn, and that book became the pointer and guide toward developing my own meditation practice. Combining that with some therapeutic treatment that I was receiving, I began to notice positive changes almost immediately in my life. So as my personal practice grew and developed, I began to naturally notice changes in my work environment. Prior to this, I was having some trouble coping with the demands of my teaching career. Class sizes were increasing, academic demands were changing, and the focus on testing and data-driven evidence, I was spending a majority of my day worrying and focusing on these things. I was also noticing that my students were coming to school with very challenging social and emotional needs that I didn't feel equipped to handle. As I looked at the backgrounds of my most challenging students, one common thread was clear: trauma. All of this resulted in toxic levels of stress at work, and I was beginning to question whether I could continue to be a teacher. Developing my mindful awareness practice was crucial in order for me to continue doing what I love to do. As the benefits of this practice continued to grow, I naturally began integrating these techniques into my teaching. If it was beneficial for me, how could it be beneficial for my students? So in 2013, I pursued certification through an organization called Mindful Schools out of Emory, California. And since then, I've been teaching the practice to students, teachers, administrators, local businesses, private organizations, and even law enforcement. Basically, anybody who will listen. So, this is my current class, part of them. They're cute, aren't they? Yeah, not so much by Friday. No. Clearly, I should have been the winner of the Pajama Day contest. This was in December. There was some argument in my classroom about this. I felt I had the cutest pajamas. They're a little sheep with little black, and it had a hood. I mean, really, Aiden had Superman pajamas. It's not very original to me. So I lost, and I dealt with it. Clearly, I'm over that. So when I ask my students about their experiences of mindfulness, most of them say things like, it helps me calm down when I'm upset. It helps me focus when I'm trying to do my work. And it helps me fall asleep at night. That's a big one. But when I asked Asfar Malik, he said this, and I couldn't agree with him more. When you do mindfulness, your heart and your whole body feels like they are home. This was the experience that I was having. Sorry. My kid's tenderness touched me. So, it seems like the talk of mindfulness is everywhere these days. Education, law enforcement, the military, our medical field, sports, advertising, and media. When I stop to reflect on this, I think, why is that? And I think a lot of it has to do with the toxicity that is happening in all of our major institutions. We need to find a way to cope and thrive. So this is Dr. Dan Siegel. I really appreciate his definition of mindfulness, and it's the one that we're going to use today. There are several definitions out there. I like his the best. He's the clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA. He's the founding co-director of Mindful Awareness at the Research Center in UCLA. He's a leading expert in interpersonal neurobiology, and he's the author of many, many books, but this one in particular is used a lot in education, called The Whole Brain Child. So this is what he says about mindfulness. Mindfulness is a way of being aware of what is happening within us and around us, with a clear focus on attention, moment to moment, what our experience is, that enables us to be fully present for life. In many ways, cultivating mindfulness means we develop the ability to sense life deeply and also to observe our experiences as well. Studies of mindfulness training and the structure and function on the brain reveal that mindfulness promotes the important integrative fibers that help us with regulation of emotion, attention, thought, and behavior. These executive functions in ourselves, and for me, in my students, can be cultivated through mindfulness training. I like to think of the case for mindfulness connected to this idea of autopilot. A device that steers a ship, an aircraft, or a spaceship in place of a person is the definition of autopilot. And I really think that we spend a lot of our lives living on autopilot. We go through our days, day in and day out, forming habits, rarely stopping to look at them and ask ourselves important questions like, is this habit really serving me? Or is it really harming me in some way? So take the case for speaking out of turn. Have you ever been in a conversation with someone and while they're speaking to you, you're forming in your mind how you're going to respond to them? You might even be building a defense against what they're saying. So we're really not plugged into, in that moment, being aware of what's really the communication, what's happening in this moment. Instead, we're stuck in our minds developing a rebuttal. Or perhaps we even say something that we regret later, and we look back on it and we think, what was I thinking? Why did I say that? I just damaged that relationship. Or what about when we're driving? How many of us take the same path to work every day, back and forth? Do you ever get there and think, how did I get here? I'm here, I'm safe, but I don't remember really the drive. Well, why is that? Because our minds are not present. We're lost in the past, ruminating over something that happened yesterday while we're driving. Or perhaps we're forward thinking into the future, full of anxiety about what's ahead, maybe even when we get to work that day. All of these experiences keep us checked out of our lives. What about when we eat? How many of us keep our lives so busy that when we need to have dinner, it's an inconvenience? So we stop, we eat out of a bag on the way to the next activity. Before you know it, we're not paying attention to what we've put in our bodies, and we wonder why our body is breaking down. Overweight, unhealthy. So I have this experience usually around Thanksgiving that says I'm never eating again. Stop. So for me, this is really a strong case for learning to pay attention to the moment. Not an easy task, but one I have found worth taking on. So I like to think of mindfulness as the great interrupter. It's a practice of pausing at any moment, just stopping to notice and to be curious, to become aware, to take our system off of autopilot and to see what's going on right now. In order to understand this a little bit more fully, I want to address the autonomic nervous system. So we know that our nervous system has two branches. The sympathetic portion that gets us all revved up when we need it to keep us safe. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system. That portion is like the brake to the accelerator. It slows everything down so that we can pause, reflect, consider. These systems can get stuck. How many of you have experiences with people who only seem to express themselves on a stuck-on position, in like a fight position? Anger is their default mode, rejection, or fear to the point where it's just off-putting. Or the opposite might be, where their system is stuck off. There's depression, chronic fatigue in the body. It just doesn't seem like we can get over these things. What we want to look for and strive for in our lives for health is to keep that system functioning in that normal range there where we're really flowing. There's a trigger. We notice that we're revved up, but we have the ability to calm that, to self-soothe that before it happens again. So we have this normal range going on. But what we find in our society is that a lot of people, when they're triggered, either respond in two ways: stuck on or stuck off. Not a good place for us to live. This is how our body breaks down. Cortisol builds up in the bloodstream. We get high blood pressure. We have chronic fatigue. And so mindfulness is a really great tool to learn to use to avoid these things. The next slide I want us to dive into today is Dr. Dan Siegel. We met him earlier. I talked about him earlier in the presentation. He's going to talk about mindfulness and the brain, specifically how it functions with the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, and how mindful awareness practice can be used to calm that nervous limbic system down.
Understanding how mindfulness works is by looking into the circuitry of the brain. And so we all have actually a handy model of the brain, which is actually our hand. So if you take your hand and fold your thumb into the middle of your palm and your fingers over, this would be an example of a brain where the person's eyes are here, the top of their head is here, their brain is connected to the body itself at the spinal cord, which is represented in your wrist. The way the brain is composed, its architecture, helps us understand how mindfulness works. If you lift your fingers up and lift your thumb up, we go to the first part of the brain in the skull, which is here called the brainstem. And this is where you have the regulation of the body, and where you also have the fight, flight, and freeze response that are created. This area of the brainstem, very primitive area, works together with the next area that's on top of it called the limbic area, and this is represented by the thumb. The limbic area helps generate our emotions. There are parts of it that help us feel our feelings. We also distinguish different aspects of memory, and in particular, this limbic area responds to our relationships. Okay, now this limbic area and brainstem area, they work together. And because these are below the next area of the brain, the cortex, we call them subcortical. A lot of our impulses, our automatic behaviors, our just innate learned reactions to things, our instincts, are driven by these subcortical areas, including information that comes up from the body itself. Your heart pounding, your intestines churning, feed up to the limbic area in the brainstem and get you all revved up. So that's a kind of loop that creates what we call our emotional state. The cortex developed when we became mammals also, as the limbic area did, but the front part of this cortex, from your second to last knuckles down to your fingernails, the front part developed when we became primates, and this part where your fingernails are is called the prefrontal cortex because it's the frontmost part of the frontal lobe. This is the part that's most developed in humans. And it's this part that gives us the ability to pause before acting on an impulse. And the way it works is there are fibers that come down from this middle prefrontal area that actually calm down the irritable limbic area or brainstem area. Literally, this prefrontal region regulates the lower subcortical, limbic, brainstem, and even bodily areas. So, in many ways, what we think happens is mindful awareness practice creates a state of activation in that moment that in a way harnesses the power of this prefrontal area in that moment. As you repeatedly practice something, that state can become a trait because neurons which are firing together wire together. So with the strengthening of this prefrontal area, what happens is, for example, if a child is angry, and the brainstem is activating a fight response. The limbic area works with that to develop a feeling of fear. There's a sense of betrayal by what happens. So you're really angry, you're burning up, your heart is pounding, and everything is going to get you to fight, to get a knife, to get a gun, to hit someone, to do something really violent. But your prefrontal cortex has you pause. And the very parts of the brain that allow you to pause are also the same part of the brain, this middle prefrontal area, that allows you to have insight into what's going on. My heart's pounding, I'm really angry. Empathy for someone else. Maybe that guy didn't mean it, or maybe he's doing the best he can. And then even a sense of morality. So when we develop the middle prefrontal areas, we actually can not only pause, but we can think of the larger social good and enact a behavior that's better for everyone. And that's where mindfulness really alters things like bullying, like violent acts of aggression. And it's where mindfulness can change the world, literally one person, one relationship at a time.
Did anybody go to high school in the 1980s? You don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to. The only reason I ask is because that was Whitesnake, the hairband. That's really the reason why I chose that video. I loved Whitesnake in high school. I'm kidding, it's not the reason, but. So I also like to look at this idea using this slide here. I really enjoy this graphic. So let's just imagine that there's a trigger, that something happens. Immediately, if there's a perceived threat, even if there isn't a threat, just a perception of a threat, your amygdala begins to alarm. Danger, danger, danger. The sympathetic nervous system kicks in. That's the sumo wrestler up there. I really like that graphic. Gonna protect yourself. Adrenaline begins to build. Then you perceive other people as threatening, even if they're not. Your body is sending you a message, and you're believing it. And in some cases, it's important to believe it. but in some cases, it's good to pause and reflect first. Then there's a reaction. We know that reactions occur not just from what's happening presently, but also as a mix of memories and other situations that come flooding in immediately. This then reinforces negative patterns and old habits. We end up feeling terrible, damaging the relationship, treating other people poorly. This leaves us feeling less safe, less secure, loved, and protected. And then we feel an even greater need for protection. So we build that up more, and then we start scanning for threats. When's the next shoe going to drop? And then before you know it, something happens, and this cycle repeats itself. A brain that has gone through mindfulness training looks more like this. Over time, something happens. You've trained your system to pause, to consider the context. And that training comes from activating the breath. When the breath gets activated, deep breathing, you slow your system down. The parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, and it gives you just a little bit of space to notice your feelings, to consider the feelings of other people, to see the big picture, to think about the consequences and different options for choices that you have in that moment. Gives you a feeling of competency. And then over time, what happens is we end up showing more compassion, more empathy towards other people. And of course, our relationships become more secure. Then we feel more loved, safe, and more protected. And so when the next time something happens, we respond more in this way. I think it's a better way to live. So what we're really getting at here is the self-regulation of attention. What I do not like about this slide is the guy in the middle. There's no magic in this position. I go to yoga 3 times a week. I don't even like this position. So when I practice meditation, I sit in a chair similar to the one that you're in today. Here's what happens. You begin with focusing on the feeling of the breath in the body, the sensation of breathing. And then, of course, your brain is made for thinking, and pretty soon, one of 3 things might happen. A visual image might pop in your mind. A thought might pop in your mind. A sensation that's unpleasant might pop in your mind and pull you off of your focus. And in that moment, you simply recognize, without judging it, that you're off of your focal point, which is the breath. You acknowledge it. Then you, with kindness, direct your attention back to the sensation of breathing in your body. And you just simply repeat this for 1 minute a day, and then 3 minutes a day, and then 9 minutes a day, and then for as long as you want to. Every time that you do this practice, it will be different, because what we know about life is that every moment is different. So I would like for us to practice together. I'm going to guide you through it. And when you're done, you're going to look like this guy. You're going to have a stronger prefrontal cortex area, I hope. So you don't need to do anything special. Sit with your feet comfortably on the floor. If you have something in your hands, go ahead and put it down for just a second. And then if you're comfortable, you can let your eyes close. But if that's not accessible for you, by all means, you can keep them open and then just let your gaze fall forward on the floor. Feel the weight of your body in the chair that you're seated in. Notice any sounds in the room. Center your attention on the feeling of the breath. You may notice this high under the nose where the air is drawn in. There may be a cool feeling there. Or you might notice it better in the chest area or the belly area. Wherever the sensation lies for you, rest there. Notice the natural feeling of breathing in and out. just the normal breath. If you're struggling to connect to the sensation, take a larger breath and see what you notice. As you're feeling the sensation of breathing, you can make a quiet notation in your mind. You can whisper this thought, breath, breath. Breathing in, breath, breath. Breathing out, breath, breath. When a thought arises or something takes your attention away from the breath, simply note it as not the breath. You can recognize it just in this way. Breath, not the breath. It might be the most beautiful thought in the world. It might be the most terrible thought in the world. It doesn't matter. It's just simply not the breath. You don't have to judge yourself or get lost in a thought or even elaborate it. You just simply recognize that it's not the breath and gently let go. Then bring your attention back. It's breath, not breath. Some of your thoughts may be tender or caring. Some might be cruel or hurtful. But they're simply not the breath. See them, recognize them, and then let them go. Thoughts are like clouds in the sky. Some are fluffy and nice to look at. Some are ominous and dark. Not the breath. Let them go. Pause here to check in with your body for a second. Where do you notice tension? Can you use the breath to relax that area a little bit, giving you a little bit more freedom? Our habitual tendency is to grab onto a thought and build a story around it, or push it away, or struggle against it. Here we stay even, balanced, and calm. Whatever your experience of this meditation has been, greatly relaxing, perhaps irritating, whatever your experience is fine. When you're ready and at your own pace, take 3 intentional breaths in and out. This practice is not always comforting. We hold areas of tension in our body that we ignore a lot, and when we stop to pause in this way, they get our attention sometimes. So if this was difficult physically for you, that's okay. Using the breath can help you relax those areas in your body that are tight or tense. So beginning over time, starting with a minute a day, short moments of awareness repeated over time become continuous. Same way we build a bad habit. We start small, gets integrated, and before you know it, we've got something negative happening. It can work in the positive. Practicing pausing, neurons that fire together, wire together, create new neural networks, new pathways, new ways of being in the world, strengthening that prefrontal cortex area. Over time, you find yourself naturally responding in different ways and being less reactive. This is called neuroplasticity. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Want to make a bet is my response. Reported benefits that show up are improvements in concentration, improvements in the nervous system, resiliency, self-care, better sleep, and better awareness of balance, acceptance, and a decrease in chronic pain. I want to say one thing about this here. Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn, when he did his mindfulness-based stress reduction work out of the University of Boston in Massachusetts, he basically opened a stress center for people who were experiencing chronic pain. And what he found was that pain can be lessened when you use mindful awareness practice to get rid of the story that you're telling yourself about the chronic pain that's on top of the pain itself. With mindful awareness practice, we begin to question our thinking, our ways of being, and pretty soon what he found is that people were experiencing pain. They had real reason for that pain to be there, but it was more manageable because the story that they were telling themselves about the pain had changed. That's huge to me. And then another important benefit is increased empathy and improved relationships. So let's talk about some of the leading researchers. The gentleman on your far left is Dr. Richie Davidson. He's a professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, right in our own backyard. He's a leading expert on neuroplasticity and the co-founder of the Center for Healthy Minds. Lots of research being done at his lab. Dan Goleman is in the middle. He is the co-founder of the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. This is called CASTLE. Teachers are using this a lot in their classrooms. Started in Yale, moved it from Yale right here to the University of Illinois. He's also an author for the New York Times in brain and behavioral science, and he wrote a book called Emotional Intelligences. Probably familiar with that one, along with a lot of other books. I mean, seriously, what do these guys do all day? I mean, I feel when I look at the things they accomplish. Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn on the far right, molecular biologist, creator of the mindfulness-based stress reduction program out of the University of Boston. Then he wrote this big book called Full Catastrophe Living, all about the science behind the practice, and he's written lots of other books too. If you're interested in diving into the research, I suggest that you look these 3 guys up. and also this guy right here, Judson Brewer. He is the Associate Professor of Medicine and Psychiatry in Boston. He's also an adjunct faculty member at Yale University and a research affiliate at MIT. He uses mindfulness practices for training for the purposes of ending addiction, like smoking, emotional eating, and anxiety. And he uses it for habit change along with reward-based learning models. These are his apps that he has online. You can put them on your phone. I have used the anxiety one, and I found it to be really exceptional. So here's Judson Brewer. He's going to talk to us about habit formation and mindfulness. He does pick on smokers a little, sorry. But I'm sorry and I'm not sorry.
When I was first learning to meditate, the instruction was to simply pay attention to my breath, and when my mind wandered, to bring it back. Sounded simple enough, yet I'd sit on these silent retreats, sweating through t-shirts in the middle of winter. I'd take naps every chance I got because it was really hard work. Actually, it was exhausting. The instruction was simple enough, but I was missing something really important. So why is it so hard to pay attention? Well, studies show that even when we're really trying to pay attention to something, like maybe this talk, at some point about half of us will drift off into a daydream or have this urge to check our Twitter feed. So what's going on here? It turns out that we're fighting one of the most evolutionarily conserved learning processes currently known in science, one that's conserved back to the most basic nervous systems known to man. This reward-based learning process is called positive and negative reinforcement, and basically goes like this. We see some food that looks good. Our brain says, calories, survival. We eat the food, we taste it tastes good. And especially with sugar, our body sends a signal to our brain that says, remember what you're eating and where you found it. We lay down this context-dependent memory and learn to repeat the process next time. See food, eat food, feel good, repeat. Trigger, behavior, reward. Simple, right? Well, after a while, our creative brains say, you know what? You can use this for more than just remembering where food is. You know, next time you feel bad, why don't you try eating something good so you'll feel better? We thank our brains for the great idea. Try this and quickly learn that if we eat chocolate or ice cream when we're mad or sad, we feel better. Same process, just a different trigger. Instead of this hunger signal coming from our stomach, this emotional signal, feeling sad, triggers that urge to eat. Maybe in our teenage years, we were a nerd at school, and we see those rebel kids outside smoking, we think, hey, I want to be cool, so we start smoking. The Marlboro Man wasn't a dork, and that was no accident. See cool, smoke to be cool, feel good. Repeat. Trigger, behavior, reward. And each time we do this, we learn to repeat the process, and it becomes a habit. So later, feeling stressed out triggers that urge to smoke a cigarette or to eat something sweet. Now with these same brain processes, we've gone from learning to survive to literally killing ourselves with these habits. So back to my breath. What if instead of fighting our brains or trying to force ourselves to pay attention, we instead tapped into this natural reward-based learning process, but added a twist? What if instead we just got really curious about what was happening in our momentary experience? I'll give you an example. In my lab, we studied whether mindfulness training could help people quit smoking. Now, just like trying to force myself to pay attention to my breath, they could try to force themselves to quit smoking. And the majority of them had tried this before and failed, on average 6 times. Now, with mindfulness training, we dropped the bit about forcing and instead focused on being curious. In fact, we even told them to smoke. What? Yeah, we said, go ahead and smoke. Just be really curious about what it's like when you do. And what did they notice? Well, here's an example from one of our smokers. She said, mindful smoking smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck. Now, she knew cognitively that smoking was bad for her. That's why she joined our program. What she discovered just by being curiously aware when she smoked was that smoking tastes like shit. Now, she moved from knowledge to wisdom. She moved from knowing in her head that smoking was bad for her to knowing it in her bones. And this spell of smoking was broken. She started to become disenchanted with her behavior. Now, the prefrontal cortex, that youngest part of our brain from an evolutionary perspective, it understands on an intellectual level that we shouldn't smoke. And it tries its hardest to help us change our behavior, to help us stop smoking, to help us stop eating that second, that third, that fourth cookie. We call this cognitive control. We're using cognition to control our behavior. Unfortunately, this is also the first part of our brain that goes offline when we get stressed out, which isn't that helpful. Now, we can all relate to this in our own experience. We're much more likely to do things like yell at our spouse or kids when we're stressed out or tired, even though we know it's not going to be helpful. We just can't help ourselves. Now, when the prefrontal cortex goes offline, we fall back into our old habits, which is why this disenchantment is so important. Seeing what we get from our habits helps us understand them in a deeper level, to know it in our bones, so we don't have to force ourselves to hold back or restrain ourselves from behavior. We're just less interested in doing it in the first place. And this is what mindfulness is all about. Seeing really clearly what we get when we get caught up in our behaviors, becoming disenchanted on a visceral level, and from this disenchanted stance, naturally letting go. This isn't to say that, poof, magically we quit smoking, but over time, as we learn to see more and more clearly the results of our actions, we let go of old habits and form new ones. The paradox here is that mindfulness is just about being really interested in getting close and personal with what's actually happening in our bodies and minds from moment to moment. This willingness to turn toward our experience rather than trying to make unpleasant cravings go away as quickly as possible. And this willingness to turn toward our experience is supported by curiosity, which is naturally rewarding. What does curiosity feel like? It feels good. And what happens when we get curious? We start to notice that cravings are simply made up of body sensations. Oh, there's tightness, there's tension, there's restlessness, and that these body sensations come and go. These are bite-sized pieces of experiences that we can manage from moment to moment, rather than getting clobbered by this huge, scary craving that we choke on. In other words, when we get curious, we step out of our old fear-based reactive habit patterns and we step into being. We become this inner scientist where we're eagerly awaiting that next data point. Now, this might sound too simplistic to affect behavior, but in one study we found that mindfulness training was twice as good as gold standard therapy at helping people quit smoking. So it actually works. So if you don't smoke or stress eat, maybe the next time you feel this urge to check your email when you're bored or you're trying to distract yourself from work, or maybe to compulsively respond to that text message when you're driving, see if you can tap into this natural capacity. Just be curiously aware of what's happening in your body and mind in that moment. It will just be another chance to perpetuate one of our endless and exhaustive habit loops, or step out of it. Instead of see text message, compulsively text back, feel a little bit better, notice the urge, get curious, feel the joy of letting go, and repeat.
It was that easy. So, let's review quickly what mindfulness is and isn't. Is intentionally cultivating the ability to pay attention non-judgmentally in the present moment. It's a training, a practice in noticing what's happening in the heart, in the mind, and in the body. And it's a tool that we use to notice what our minds are really up to. It's supported by neuroscience. It's not religious. It's not a behavioral management system. When I talk to teachers, I highlight that because we're all looking for ways to control our kids. You have 30 kids in a room, and they are all very different. It's a challenge. And it's not a quick fix because we're working with the brain, and we're working on changing habitual patterns. That takes time. So I double dog dare you to try 1 minute a day, up to 9 minutes. They say 9 minutes is the magic number. I don't know why exactly. But check in after 2 weeks. See if anything has changed in that amount of time. If you don't notice anything, then maybe the practice isn't for you. That's okay. You're not ready to do something formally? What about when you're frustrated at the copy machine at work and you're waiting in line with nothing to do and that person's taking too long? What if you just dropped that story for a second and check in with your body? What's your breathing like? What's your heart rate like? Where's their pain? Or what about at a stoplight, when that light changed intentionally when you got there? Notice that natural irritation. How dare that light change right now? What else is happening in that moment? Can you let go of that for 30 seconds and focus on your breathing? Or what about when you're in line at the grocery store and you have 1 gallon of milk and the person in front of you has 2 carts, right? We can work this into all areas of our life just by paying attention to what is going on. Here are 2 apps I highly recommend. Headspace. It is free to a certain point, and then you do have to pay. It is well worth it. They have guided meditations. They give little talks and supports for this practice. Really well done. And then Dan Harris from ABC, I don't know if you guys know who he is. He has also a podcast, which is all about meditation. He brings in special speakers, and he also wrote a book and has an app that's really helpful. And then you can reach me at my email. If you have questions, concerns, anything that you want to follow up on, I'm available. And also, if you're interested in learning more about the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, it's an 8-week program. There is a gentleman in Chicago that does it right on Michigan. I've taken his course. He's amazing. I can set you up with what you would need to contact him. Okay? Thank you.
Yes, I'm taking a group program on DBT, and they said it's part of mindfulness. And they haven't gotten to the section on mindfulness yet. Wanted your opinion of this dialectical, behavioral, something goes with
What's GBT?
D.
Oh, D.
Like D, like David,
Yeah.
B-T. Dialectical behavioral therapy, yeah.
I don't know. Somebody over there does.
Oh, you are? Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and a licensed clinical professional counselor. Dialectical behavior therapy integrates mindfulness in order to slow down the response of the emotional reactivity. It's generally focused on helping slow down conversations between people in which the relationship is high in conflict so that we can get out of the fight cycles.
Yeah.
And it kind of helps give people scripts for I'm feeling, kind of like I statements. I'm feeling this. Here are some of the reasons I think I'm feeling this. Here are some of the things I'm observing. And then there's a lot of body awareness, with it. My heart is pounding, or I feel really hot, or, I'm feeling numb or something like that, so that it brings the awareness to that rather than just ejecting it into the relationship through conflict.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi. You mentioned that we should start meditation at 1 minute and go gradually increase until we did it for 9 minutes. Over what time period would you recommend?
In my classroom, we do it 3, 4, 5 times a day, and I have 7-year-olds. So we take that 1 minute and just check in. I would do it as frequently as you can during the day. A more formal practice. I'm sorry. Am I not?
What I was trying to get at, I thought you were speaking of a duration of one meditation duration for 1 minute. And then
Yes. Yes, you should do that. You should build on that, because the more time that you are practicing, the more your system is going to train itself to click in when you need it. When you need that moment of space before reacting to something, the deeper your meditation time, the more you've worked with your own thoughts, your own brain, your own stuff that's roaming around up here, the more rooted you are when you need to click in.
If I started today at 1 minute, when would I go to 2 minutes? That's the thing I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I don't know, because everybody's so different. And our minds are all so different. So I would say what Judson Brewer says, and that is be curious. When you sit for 1 minute, what is your system like? Is it real busy up here, or is there lots of space where there's calmness? If you feel like you can go a little bit farther, then go a little bit longer. What would it be like if you didn't set the timer at all? I don't know. You really have to be playing around with that. Everybody's different.
Okay, let's go on to the next question.
Actually, my question is more of a continued response to his question. I've been meditating for many years, and I've also talked to people about it. And by far, maybe 99%, the question or the frustration is, well, I tried it, I couldn't do it, so I gave up. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a misconception that people have an expectation that it's this wonderful magic solution, and so I sat and I tried to focus on my breath, but I just couldn't do it, so I failed. And ironically, it's that moment of frustration that is what you should be noticing.
Right.
You're not failing, you're actually, well, my question is just an explanation to help that gentleman.
Yeah.
So if you try it for 1 minute and you just can't focus on your breath because you're thinking about the shopping list or whatever, well, that you should notice that that's an opportunity to go back to your breath. And it's just that repetitive process of just continued. And so and my final sentence, so if you notice that you've successfully done that for 1 minute after trying for a week, push it out to 3 minutes or 2 or 5 or however long you can successfully do that cycle of focusing your attention on your breath. Oh, damn, I'm not paying attention to my breath. And at that moment, just bring it back to the breath. And I'm done.
Thank you.
Thank
I think
you.
that's a good conversation for the coffee hour.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much. It was a great talk. I just was wondering if you were familiar with a book called The Ghost in My Brain by Clark Elliott.
I'm not, but
He was
I
a
will.
DePaul professor who was in a car accident and sustained a concussion that went undiagnosed. And the brain just got all messed up. And he finally found, after 8 years, 2 doctors who helped rewire his brain. And he is still at DePaul, and he's doing very well.
Wow. Thank you for that.
Great. Some more questions? Oh.
Hi, thank you for an interesting talk. I really appreciate you bringing the science of this out to people, because I think when I first started meditating, I am a neurobiologist, and the first thing I thought about it was that it was based on religious practices, and that there was no evidence to show that it works.
Right.
And so I was actually wondering if you'd comment a little bit more on the types of experiments that have been done specifically to show that this is demonstrably effective for different mental illnesses.
I would like to comment to that. It's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. But I am going to defer to these experts, and I am going to suggest that if you are more interested in that you look these guys up. And you'll have to do that on your own, because I did not prepare enough about the neuroscience, and I don't want to misspeak, because I'm not a neurobiologist. So I would definitely look up these 3 heavy hitters here. I know the American Academy of Pediatrics has done some studies. Look that up also. Some of the journals are not free, unfortunately, when you do your searching. So you might have to pay to download any of that material. And I will also say this. This neuroscience research is young. And there is pushback against it, and there should be, because we're dealing with people's minds. And when we're talking about kids, we really need to see the research on that. So there does need to be more peer review and greater science-based material out there for people like me to be able to disseminate and study and whatnot. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking it.
So I have a question about how do we approach people who are easily agitated when they're confronted in this type of meditation? Because I know people who can't sit down for like more than 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. And like, just how do we approach that? I know teaching kids, that's a very good starting ground, but how do we approach kids that have that agitation mm-hmm. that they can't just sit? Mm-hmm. And that's basically my question, because it's not just kids, it's also adults.
Absolutely. The way I would answer it would be this. I would just tell you what I do with my kids. We use the body a lot. Kids who are agitated cannot sit still. You're not going to make them sit still, and there's no reason that they should sit still. So we do stretching, yoga. You can go for walks. You can do mindful walking. You can ask kids to feel. Kids like this are out of their bodies. They are up here, and their bodies, they have no connection to what their body is doing. So this takes a long time. It's a long process, but you can go out in nature. They need to be in the sunshine. They need to get fresh air, and you can do, walking meditations. What's it like when you put your foot on the earth? What do you notice when your foot comes up? What muscles do you notice? What's happening? Yoga is very powerful because it activates the vagus nerve, and that then clicks in the parasympathetic nervous system, and before they know it, they're calmer simply because their body has been triggered to respond in that way. Over time, they build the capacity to sit a little stiller and to be a little more rooted. It takes time. You have to be patient with them, especially. You can also use sound. I will ring a bell in my classroom. I have a chime that rings for a really long time, and I'll ask my students, just take a deep breath. Now I'm going to ring this bell, and when it's done ringing, then raise your hand. And suddenly, the room is extremely still, even my kids who can't sit still, because what are they doing? They're focusing on a sound, and they follow that sound till it stops, and then they go, I heard that. And you've got 5 seconds of space where they have been still and present and listening. And that over time you can build on. Now in my classroom, when things get crazy, I ring a bell for a different purpose. And I just say, check in with your body. And they immediately put a hand here for pressure, and they put a hand on their belly for pressure, and they take 3 breaths and just check in. What's happening here? I'm starving. I can't wait to go to lunch. So-and-so took my pencil. I feel like hitting him. Whatever's happening. So giving them those frequent opportunities to practice. Does that answer your question? Close enough. Yeah. I have an adult son who has ADHD, and I know exactly what you're talking. Weight is really helpful. Weighted blankets, books on a lap, anything that can give a person a feeling of being grounded.
Any questions upstairs? Please come down.
Hi.
Hi.
Lately I've found that a certain trigger of mine is in the news daily. How do you recommend trying to keep up with the daily news without having this certain person enter my mind space ever?
We can all use that.
Oh, man. I limit my interaction. I can't take it either. I limit my interaction. And I pay attention during my meditation time when I am feeling, I'm just going to say it, hateful or enraged or agitated or frustrated. I notice that. Emotion is energy that needs movement, right? So when you feel an emotion arising during your meditation time, pay attention to it. It's sending you a signal that it wants to be heard. Name it to tame it and let it go. And then, if it's possible, send a kind wish or a kind message to yourself for that bravery. Because sometimes we want to hang on to that so that we can build a defense and fight against it. And there are times when we need to fight against things. I would say, let it go, come back to the breath, and try to be kind towards it. Yeah, and turn off the television.
I remember at one time, not too long ago, there was a lot of resistance from some religious groups to meditation because it originated in the Eastern traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you have noticed any change in that over time.
Yes. When I go into public schools to talk with teachers, administrators, and staff members about meditation, that's one of the questions that comes up. And what I try to do is to address the fact that just because you're teaching someone an inward practice does not mean that you're teaching them to be religious, especially students. When you're teaching someone to be contemplative and to notice what's happening in their heart, in their minds, and in their body, that's not a religious practice. Now, each religion may have its own contemplative practice, but that doesn't in and of itself, the act of mindfulness meditation doesn't make it religious. We're not worshiping anything. We're working with our system. And what we find with this system is that when we are kind and compassionate towards it, it responds in ways that serve us. Does that make sense? It's a good question.
How can one apply mindfulness to concentrating on what one is doing when one has to perform a boring physical task?
How can one apply mindfulness to a boring task?
Right. When one has to perform a boring physical task.
A boring physical task. The same way that you do any other task. You pay attention to what it is you're doing, and you notice you're thinking about the task. I hate to clean. I love a clean house, but I hate the cleaning part. That's boring and physical work to me. So I notice I'm dusting and I'm agitated. Do I have any other options here? Really, can I turn on some music that makes me feel better? Can I just accept that I'm feeling agitated and that will go away once the dusting is done? Mindfulness is about being with what's happening and working with it skillfully, even when it's boring. This is something that my kids bring up to me during meditation. I don't want to sit here for a minute. This is boring. What's it like to be bored? I don't know. Well, experience boredom. What is that like to you? You know? Then suddenly things change a little bit. They become a little bit more comfortable with being bored. I think there was a famous person that said that boredom is connected to creativity. So if you're a creative, bored person, you've got a lot going on, that's a good thing. So, thank you.
Great. One more. Go ahead.
I think you answered this question a moment ago. I took a trip to Southeast Asia and had a private session with a Buddhist monk in learning how to meditate. So that sort of was an introductory experience in that area for me. And so I'm curious about the intersection between Buddhism, which seems to be either a cultural discovery or cultural invention, you might call it. And so since it's been around for so long, presumably it has some value. And the intersection between Buddhism, other religions, which, this is kind of a vague question, and biofeedback, and the scientific approach to all this, which is going on in this country to try to discover these interrelationships.
Yeah. Well, I think no matter what religion, if you are religious, what religion you come from, we're all looking for ways to survive this life and to live a life of enjoyment and peace and to make a difference in the world. So I know for myself, had I have been taught this practice that some will say is connected to Buddhism, but if I had been taught this practice as a young girl, I would have saved myself a lot of suffering in my life, in spite of what my religious beliefs are. This is a body practice, a mind practice. And yes, every major religion has some sort of contemplative practice connected to it. But I think for what we did here today and what I do in the secular public school system is really teaching kids to notice what their minds are up to and how their choices are either serving them or harming them. And they're either putting out more love, acceptance into the world, or the opposite is happening. This is a practice that helps you notice what's going on up here, because what's going on up here is coming out at somewhere. It's either going to help or harm. I don't know if I really got to your question. It was a tough one.
Final question.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
It's kind of a two-part, or kind of have two questions. One is, when I try to meditate, I notice that I have all these endless images running through my head, and I'm not sure what to do with all these images. And the second one, since you're talking about children, was what would be like a resource for a parent to get their child involved with meditation or some kind of meditation class or mindfulness class? I know a child like in the Highland Park kind of area who maybe they could benefit from it.
As far as the child, I would look up mindfulschools.org, because there are trained professionals like myself who work with kids in a secular framework, in a non-religious way. So I would go there. Yep. Amazon also has a lot of books on meditation and kids. I would dig through that. You have to be selective because there's a lot of religious-oriented material as well. So you want to be the one to go through all that. And then the question about images, and just to thank you for your response, it was very skillful. And you could probably speak to this as well, too. What do you do about images when you're meditating? Nothing. Nothing. You do. You do. It's a distraction. It's not the breath. So you notice, and you can even name it, maybe like it's an image of a person, right? So person or animal or vacation last year. Whoa, that's there. Okay, and then let it pass. There's really nothing to do about it. Your brain was made to do these things. So resisting it makes it persist, and it makes it bigger. So the problem, one of the reasons why you're probably having more imagery coming up is because you're paying attention to it so much, right? So notice it, name it to tame it, and let it go. Do you have to name it, or is it... Sometimes labeling can be really useful because your brain likes to have things packaged in neat little organized ways. So, yeah. I do a lot of teaching in my head during meditation time. Like I'm teaching math in my head while I'm sitting on my couch, breathing in and out. So then I notice, teaching math, calling Mary, if you grab onto it and wrap another story around it, this shouldn't be here, it shouldn't be this way, it will get bigger.
Great, thank you.